I want to try using Gall liquid with my watercolor. It's a special medium that's supposed to improve the flow of colors on paper. Let's give it a quick try on a smaller format. The instructions said to add it to your painting water or to just your palette in a very small amount. And I have to say the effect is very subtle, but I can see it, that the color flows a little bit better when I use this medium. Alright, let's start painting. I will be working on these two beautiful fish. I found this photo online. I will leave you the link in the description if you want to try it as well. And looking at this photo, I think I will also need to use some other things at the end of the painting process to create the texture. So I hope you watch to the end to find out what else besides watercolor I used to paint this fish. I start by going through basically all my warm colors. Gouache, permanent orange, scarlet lake, Sennelier red, and I give the tails and the fins of those fish a first wash very loosely, allowing the colors to flow and mix on paper. I'm using 300 pound, 640 gram cold pressed watercolor paper. I already ruined the other side of this sheet, so I'm painting on the back side. You know, with this heavyweight paper, you can paint on both sides without any warping, without any problems. So I taped off the area where my fish are going to be, and I don't even need to stretch or pin this paper because it stays in place. These are called Siamese fighting fish. I read that they're pretty aggressive. They're very popular with people who have aquariums because you can imagine why. They're so beautiful, but they sure like to fight, so that's the name. Red is such a fun color to paint with. If you want to know how I picked colors for my palette and how exactly I use them, red specifically, but that would apply to basically any other color on your palette, you could watch my class Radiant Red. It's available on my website timerub.com, and go to classes and on-demand classes, or if you have Skillshare membership, it's there as well. Building your palette is not a matter of, you know, just going to the store one time. It's a process, and in that class I talk a lot about that process and how I make the decision to add certain colors, red specifically, to my palette. I also see some cooler reds in the fins and the tails, so going into my cooler reds, this is anthraquinoid red. Okay, my first layer is dry. Let's add a drop of this Gall to the palette and see what happens. I think what I'm going to do is sprinkle it on my fish and see if it will have any effect. And I'm going to paint the body of this blue fish with ultramarine blue and applying a light layer. I can see that Gall kind of pushes the paint away, somewhat similar to if you use alcohol with watercolor, and creates very subtle texture that looks a little bit like scales. I can enhance that further when I have the painting a little more developed, but this is a pretty nice effect. Might be a little bit hard to see on the camera, but it's there. Let's keep working on this fish. Even though the outline of the fish is well defined, inside the fish I'm trying to work, if you can say it like that, inside the outline of the fish I'm trying to work very loosely and let the colors float and mingle, because those variations of color I see are not sharp, they're very subtle. And let's add some more shadows on the tail with a small brush using the same colors that I used, only in high saturation, straight out of the wells. Alright, and the other fish has no blue, so Scarlet Lake I think is the closest color. I'm going to dilute it considerably to create the body. Let's give it a little sprinkle of Gall to create the texture there as well, and also I am going to paint those little shadows on the tail and the fins. Alright, this is pretty much it for the fish. I am going to add even more texture a little bit later with other materials. Let's work on the background. The background in the photo is flat black, but I don't want to do that, even though I could, but I want to use a couple shades of watercolor. I will be using ultramarine blue and also color called Indigo by Daniel Smith, and by mixing these two colors I will create a dark background, but it will hopefully have depth and variety and visual interest. as soon as I apply watercolor here in the center, once it dries just a little bit, I apply some salt to it before it dries completely. It needs to have some shine, but not like standing water. I already painted a similar fish on dark background, and I used salt for texturing very successfully, I think. I will leave you the link to that video so you can check it out for yourself. So I think I want to use that salt effect in this painting as well. The key to using salt is to apply it at the right moment, because if your surface is too wet, it will just dissolve and not absorb any color. And if your background is completely dry, it will not work at all, obviously. Don't think that salt needs to be applied like everywhere. So I'm going to keep it to the central portion of my painting to keep it as focal point. And so I want the most visual interest in that spot. Mixing ultramarine blue and indigo directly on paper. You see, I'm creating pretty interesting varied background. Maybe a little more salt in this corner to kind of continue that theme. Carefully working around my fish. They're completely dry, so paint I'm applying on the background doesn't run into the body of the fish. So it's important to let them dry completely, otherwise it's going to be a mess. And there by the fish on the left, you see that salt floated on watercolor. It created very interesting swirls. That's what we call a happy accident in watercolor. That will be very hard to do deliberately, but somehow it happened. Alright, small brush. I'm going to add a few more details to the fish with watercolor. Work on their mouths and eyes and small fins. Alright, and now, as I do in a lot of my paintings, I want to correct the edges of the fish with some white artist gouache using very small brush. Important thing here is not to overdo things, because you don't want whole areas repainted white. That's not going to look right, but small brush strokes will blend with watercolor and not be noticeable. No matter how hard I try to paint around the fish carefully, edges need correction, because it's very hard for me to get to all these small spikes on their tails and fins when painting the background, so they need to be brought back with a small brush later in the painting. You can see my fish is really taking shape after I'm adding all these small details. Even though I did manage to create some texture in the bodies of the fish with watercolor and by using ox gall, I still want to define the scales a little bit better. And for that, I am going to use color pencils. I have my Prismacolor set. I've never used color pencils on this 300-pound paper, so let's see how they're going to work. First, I am going to work on the outer edge of the fish with indigo pencil and correct some edges where my watercolor didn't go down exactly the way I wanted it. And then I can also add some tiny little details on the fish. It will be very hard to do with a brush, because you will need a brush that has like just a couple of hairs. So sharp pencil works much better than a brush loaded with water and pigment for creating fine lines, fine details. Color pencils on this really thick watercolor paper, of course, don't go in smoothly or flat. They only sit on top of that texture, which is perfect for my purposes, and it looks kind of like dry brush. They don't stand out and they don't look like mixed media, which I wouldn't want them to look like. They really look like part of watercolors. So I highly recommend this technique for small details in watercolor. And I can also use white pencil. It is not going to have the same coverage as white gouache. It's translucent rather than opaque, but it's great for softening the edges. Portions of the tails of the fish and their fins look kind of semi-transparent, so applying a layer of white pencil on top of bright watercolor passages creates the illusion of transparency of the tail. Alright, we can spend hours and hours working on all these details, but I think it's time to stop. Let me know in comments what you think about all these techniques I showed you in this painting. I think the background turned out a lot more interesting than in the reference photo. Let me know if you agree with that. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one here on Time Up Studios channel. Help other artists to see this video by liking or sharing it. To see future videos, subscribe and click the bell button to be notified when they're published. Thanks again and stay creative!